Welcome everyone and thanks for coming. So my name is Lee Wang Choi and I'm based in Malaysia, was based in Singapore, and I'm very happy to be here in Ho Chi Minh City. I'm also very happy to be part of this workshop. It's been some time that Zero Station and I have had some sort of conversations and networking, but it's also very good then to convert that finally into a project, but not just a project that's an event, but really thinking about capacity building and really thinking about a long-term kind of investment and a long-term conversation. So the workshop is an art writing workshop, but it isn't just to focus on writing essays and reviews about the visual arts, but to really think more about writing as a practice. And so I was very pleasantly surprised to meet the 10 participants that come from a range of backgrounds and interests. And so, you know, we've had just a couple of days, and they haven't. They're still coming, so that's very good. They're still showing up, and they're here this evening. So one of the things that we're doing in the workshop is that we're looking at some texts about, you know, to think about writing, to think about what it means to be in Southeast Asia. I'm an art critic, and the other person who's facilitating is a curator, Hiroyuki Hattori, and he's done a lot of collaborative projects. So increasingly, when you learn about writing today, well, when you learned about writing when I was first starting, you didn't necessarily think about curating. Curating wasn't always the frame of arts discourse. It was very much artist practice, arts history. But increasingly today, curating and exhibitions and events are what sort of shape and frame a lot of the conversations. So it's a good balance to have a critic and a curator. So the seminar components of the workshop will involve exchanging ideas, and then there's very sort of practice and also meeting and sort of close discussions about the actual work of the participants. So in conjunction with this, we have a series of public talks. We kick off this evening with something that's a little bit, you know, out of the, you know, sort of falls a little bit outside. But my job here is also to show that there's, you know, very strong resonance and relevance. Giang Nguyen has, you know, done her scholarship in cultural studies. Studied in Australia and has recently returned. She's working on her first book and finishing that up. It's almost to press. Not only does she work with cultural studies, which is, of course, a field that has developed within Asia quite strongly, but in Vietnam it still hasn't sunk in very much, but also dealing with aspects of cultural studies that there is even greater resistance to, like digital culture. And what's happening there. Now, when we think about writing, so much of writing is now being distributed digitally, and the way that digital culture has completely transformed the economics, the distribution, and to what extent, or I mean, the patterns of reading, how we read, what we read. So thinking of these kind of larger cultural currents is very, very important for the workshop. So having said that, it's my pleasure to welcome Giang Nguyen to give her talk, and I'll just hand it over to her, and then afterwards I'll give a bit of commentary, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Thank you all very much.
So hi, my name is Giang, and today I'm going to talk very briefly about my ongoing research on the relationship between popular television in Vietnam and the process of national formation. So this is ongoing, and I'm going to publish this research in a book, I think hopefully next year. So I'm going to talk a bit about this point. First of all, the context. I hope that the audiences here are more familiar with the Vietnamese context than many other sort of audiences that I used to have in the past. Western audiences were not very familiar with Vietnam. And then a bit about the theoretical framework, because to look at Vietnamese nationalism in relation to popular television, we can do it in many ways. So I just do it in one particular theoretical lens. Then I'm going to focus on 3 case studies of Vietnamese popular shows and see how these shows work as cultural intervention in the way ordinary Vietnamese people identify themselves as Vietnamese. And the last point is some key conclusions that I draw from my research. So the context, very briefly, before 1980s, Vietnamese history was defined mainly by revolutionaries, events, and wars. But in 1986, we have the economic reform, and this economic reform opens an era which is quite rare, because we see the combination of state socialism or state socialist politics, or whatever it is, but it's the remaining of the past, and combined with a capitalist economy. After the reform, we see a proliferation of media, particularly popular television and the internet. So television is one of the key cultural hallmark of the post-reform era. So television in Vietnam was established in the South in 1966 and in the North in 1970. In the 1980s, after the end of the Vietnam War, television barely existed in Vietnam because we didn't have enough television sets and there was not enough electricity. So television existed, but it didn't have the actual national reach. In 1991, Vietnamese television installed what they call the national satellite system. So for the first time in the history of Vietnamese television, that the national audience can could watch the same television program together. So they are kind of synchronized. The first time in 1991. And at that point, very interesting, the most impressive cultural product on television is The Rich Also Cry. Người giàu cũng khóc. It's a Mexican soap opera. And it was just so phenomenal. Every single family just stay at home waiting for one episode of this soap opera. In 1994, we have first Vietnamese television dramas. And television dramas, imported and locally produced, are still key component of Vietnamese television content until today. In 1996, we have first game show, and then we have talk shows, reality show, contest show, reality show, and the like. Nowadays, we have a saturation of Vietnamese popular television with hundreds of channels, genres and formats and programs. With about $8 a month, you can have access to about 200 channels. 1/3 of that are international news and entertainment channels. So basically, my project is kind of challenges, or at least complicates, 2 stereotypes about Vietnamese culture and Vietnamese politics. The first one is the state-centric views that always see Vietnamese media practice as under strict censorship from the party state. Now, I'm not reject this fact, but I want to say that there's much more than that. It's not only a story of censorship and resistance, the story of production of news, truth, a regime of knowledge, and identities. The second stereotype that I want to resist is the stereotype of Vietnamese nationalism as mainly defined by war. Now, it is important to see Vietnamese nationalism as part of warfare, but after the reform, in peacetime, Vietnamese people continue to see themselves as Vietnamese. How do they do that? Do they do that through warfare practices, or do they do that in peace? How did that happen? That's the question. And I suspect that television plays a very important part in this process, because before, in the war, we didn't have television at all. And in peace, television is a very important thing that established a rhythm of everyday life in Vietnam. So I suspect that television does something on that process. And the research is about that. So the questions are, what are new national truths in the post-reform time? What are the new thinkable, sayable, feelable about nationhood enabled by television? So in saying that, my question is, what are the new conditions of possibility, new condition of intelligibility, new condition of emotionality allowed by television, particularly the popular television? And so in going beyond the stereotypical perception of Vietnamese media and Vietnamese nationalism, I propose to use Foucault's idea of power as productive instead of repressive. So it means that powers does not only kill or punish or exclude, it also produces things. It produces truth. It produces understanding, produces subjectivities. The second thing is, I don't see power as a question of who, it's a question of how. How the arrangement of discursive and non-discursive elements leads to specific ways of understanding the past, the present, and the future of some community. And in going beyond the stereotypes about political nationalism, I use the framework of banal nationalism by Michael Binglick, who says that nationalism does not come and go. It stays there latently as part of everyday life. And because it is sustained as part of everyday life, that a few moments of radical eruption can be possible. So because the question of nationalism and television is vast, it's big. So I'm going to approach this question by case studies. And the case study are selected based on the typical genre that they represent and also based on the popularity of the shows chosen. The first case study is about soap opera or television dramas, phim truyền hình. So television dramas was the key cultural product on television in Vietnam in the 1990s and early 2000s. I'm going to compare two television dramas, Hà An and The City Stories. And the key theme is nostalgia and national belonging, because the reform marked a very strong turn in the social practices in Vietnam. And the question is, how do we deal with the past? And how do we reshape the future is the key question of this case studies. Nostalgia is very interesting phenomenon because somehow our contemporary world, despite of its vast changing and uncertainty and moving forward, is filled with nostalgia. Nostalgia is combined of two words. Nostal means home and angia means pain. So nostalgia is a sense of homesickness, someone that is longing for a home that is lost, a home in the past. So nostalgia is private, is individual, but at the same time it is deeply informed by collective condition. So as Svetlana Baum say, nostalgia goes beyond individual psychology. So in this project, I kind of see memory or nostalgia as a way of governing humans and things, or culture government. To borrow Foucault's term dispositive, I see memory as the practice of dispositions of humans and things in ways that foster some specific past. So in saying that, I mean past stories are always shaped by present needs and is always orientating to some sort of imagined future, a shared future. The first drama, Hà An, tells the story of a couple who fought together in the Vietnam War. And after the war, they lived together in a small, tiny apartment and suddenly found themselves in a very poor condition, in a condition of poverty. The husband, a veteran, was stuck in the past and was surrounded by his veteran friend. He could not earn money, So the family was too poor until one day the wife realized that she could not stand this poverty anymore. So she decided to quit the army job and went to Eastern Europe as exported labor. So at that moment, she kind of refused the past that she shared with her husband at war to seek a better future. 3 years after 3 years working in Eastern Europe, after 3 years working in Eastern Europe, she came home and she became very rich. And definitely she no longer loved her husband. So her husband was stuck in the past. And she brought home a lot of money. She built a new house. It's a 3-story house, big, empty. And they could not find happiness there. So we can say that this television drama is extremely nostalgic. It's like all the story of the past, but it's also very bitter because the wife seeks a new future, so she doesn't have a past. She refuses her own past. But the husband was stuck in the past, but he doesn't have any future. The couple, one doesn't have a past and one doesn't have a future, could not have a happy ending. So she fell for another man. And they went through a lot of dramatic events, including a failed suicide. She didn't die, but she died spiritually. So at the end, there's no happy ending for the couple because they lived together in the empty house without love. This story is actually present a very common sentimentality in Vietnam today, like something, a disappointment towards the socialist past. Because so many people, a whole generation, fought for a future that never really comes. A future that is based on a dream, utopian dream, and suddenly turned into an unexpected future surrounded by money, a topsy-turvy world that's centered on market activities. And those that were stuck in the past feel bitter because they feel nostalgic, but at the same time they feel excluded by the present. So in that way we can see that there's a bit of political and cultural resistance in this sort of sentimentality. And the past, particularly the past, imprinted by socialist ideology, no longer works in the time of marketization. So logically, if the past has failed, then no future could arise. So if some unexpected future arrives, then we need to invent a new past. And that's what I found in the second television drama, which is the name is The City Stories, Chuyện Phố Phường. This story is very sentimental, and in 2002, it's already a very long television drama, 22 episodes, compared to only 3 of HIjourdN, because HIjourdN was produced in 1994 when the production capacity was very weak. But in 2002, Vietnamese television producer could produce longer television dramas. So this story tells, this is a tragedy of an old man, retired one, who is living with his blind daughter. So the girl cannot see, in a very big, beautiful colonial French house. You see the French house there. And inside the French house there is an altar that looks absolutely feudal. So you see lacquer, you see golden lacquer and red paint, and you see ancestor wearing dynastic clothes and things like that. Their peaceful life was interrupted by the return of the elder son. The elder son came home from Eastern Europe again. So Eastern Europe was the source of money, most of the time dirty money, in many Vietnamese television dramas in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So that elder son wanted to kick the father and the sister out of the house so that he can colonize the house and turn the house into an international headquarters of his cosmetic brands. That's typical, right? Money and love. The thing is, the father doesn't need money. And the girl doesn't need money neither. So the father thinks that the house has a lot of culture traditions, and he has culture dignity in the house. And whereas the girl cannot see the world, so the house is everything to her. So they don't need money, and the man cannot kick them out of the house. So in that case, the house is not empty, it's not cold as the house in Hanoi. It's actually a location of culture, heritage, and very high economic value too. It's a symbol of power, a power that combines economic value and culture tradition. And in this story, we see nothing about war, not a single thing relevant to war. It's all about culture, heritage. It's about dignity. It's about attraction, culture attraction, and the urge to protect Asian values or Vietnamese values as part of identity politics. So at the end, the son signed an evil contract with a friend. So the friend needs to seduce the girl so that the girl will love that man and get married and move out of the house. When the father is isolated in the house, it's easier to kick him out of the house, right? At the final episode, the father, in despair, agreed to sell the house to the son. But the friend suddenly, just like all television dramas, it's very illogical. The friend suddenly realized that he's doing an evil contract. So he turned his face he turned his heart to the father and the daughter, and revealed all the bad things that the son has done to the father and the daughter. The son, in embarrassment, returned to Eastern Europe, leaving the father, the daughter, and the son-in-law happily ever after in a beautiful house. So the son lost everything, and the son-in-law has everything, right? He has the girl and has the house and has dignity. So in this thing, we see a very different memorial disposition. We see a reinvention of colonial and feudal objects and practices. A very strong sense of nostalgia towards something that used to be hated. For example, the anta no longer signifies backwardness or reactionaries, because in the past, the Vietnamese Socialist Party used to punish almost all religious activities and everything related to dynastic culture. But it's no longer the case as part of the politics of heritage. And the colonial house no longer signifies enemy. It actually signifies something very globally desirable, because it is wanted to be, the son wants to transform it into an international headquarters of his cosmetic brand. And men and women are no longer soldiers, not a single one. The father, with his age, he should be a soldier, but he's not. He's a cultural worker. And I want to coin the term self-orientalism as an ethics for business doing in many Asian countries in an age of cultural globalization. And I think that this soap opera fits neatly in the immersions of self-orientalism. So that's if the first case study is orientated to